All right, welcome everyone to this ChemScore 2022 webinar. In the coming hour, you will learn about the key findings in this year's ChemScore ranking and get industry and investor perspectives on both ChemScore and the challenges and opportunities facing the chemical sector. My name is Patrik Witkowski and I work with investors at ChemSec. For those of you who don't know what ChemSec is, we are an independent non-profit working to reduce the production and use of hazardous chemicals. We do not accept any money from corporations, but receive our funding from the Swedish government, charity foundations, and private donations. We are also the organization that produces ChemScore, which is an annual ranking of the world's largest chemical companies on their efforts to reduce their chemical footprint. We published this year's ChemScore ranking last Thursday, and we have, to be quite honest, been a bit overwhelmed by the media interest from all corners of the world. It has been covered in the Financial Times, Reuters, Süddeutsche Zeitung, and many other outlets, and the number of registered attendees for this webinar is quite unprecedented for us at ChemSec. So this is of course very exciting and also telling, I think, of the fact that the chemical pollution crisis is increasingly being seen as an emergency that needs to be addressed now. And people are very interested in learning about what the companies that produce the chemicals are up to, which is of course what ChemScore is all about. So, to today's agenda. First, Jerker Lichtart, ChemSec's senior chemicals advisor, will talk about the purpose of ChemScore and the criteria used to assess the companies. Then, Sonja Haider, ChemSec's senior business and investor advisor, will present the key findings from this year's ranking. And Jerker and Sonja have since June this year and up until only a couple of days ago been knee-deep in thousands of documents, emails, and registers in order to assess the companies and finalize this year's ChemScore. So if they look a bit pale, please have some sympathy. And then I'll have a discussion with Teresa Bernheim, who is Manager's Chemical Policy at Lanxess, a German specialty chemicals company, about their remarkable improvement in this year's ChemScore. After that, Victoria Lidén, who is a sustainability analyst at Storebrand Asset Management, will join me to share some insights about why chemicals have become such a big concern for investors. And finally, Eugenie Matthew, Earth Lead at Aviva Investors, will talk about the by now much noticed investor letter that Aviva, Storebrand, and 45 other investors recently sent to the CEOs of the world's largest chemical companies. And she will also share updates on what is happening next on the investor engagement front. The webinar is 1 hour. It is being recorded and will be sent to you after so that you can share it with colleagues who couldn't make it. And also there will be some Q&A time with Jerker and Sonja. So if any questions pop up during the presentations, just click the Q&A button at the bottom of the window, write your questions, and we'll try to run through as many as we can. And if you have questions for Teresa, Victoria, or Eugenie, please also put them in the Q&A box, and they have promised me personally that they'll get back to you via email after the webinar. All right, so with that out of the way, welcome Jerker Lichtart.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Could I have next slide, please? ChemSec investors work started more than 10 years ago, but the starting point for ChemScore was much more recent, when we were approached by an investor asking us which are the worst chemical producers out there and which ones should we avoid. Having met a large number of chemical companies at meetings, conferences, and other fora, we had a pretty good idea on which ones would be better and which one would be worse, but we could not give a well-thought-through answer without making a thorough assessment. And as a matter of fact, today we have that very person asking us this question here. It's Eugenie from Aviva. I just want to say thank you for asking it. And we would like to give you an overview of what ChemScore is, its foundation, and show how it can fill the gap that exists in the usual ESG analysis, since the chemicals topic is not properly covered by any other ESG ranking as we see it. And we'll do this by explaining the methodology and knowledge base it is founded on in more detail. ChemScore builds on our experience of working with both chemical companies and investors, and we combine it with in-depth knowledge of EU and global policies, looking ahead, identifying potential risks and opportunities connected to the production of chemicals. To be able to understand in detail how they perform, we divided the criteria into 4 main categories, spotlighting 4 different ways of assessing performance. It's important to mention here that we only look at data and information found in the public domain. We cannot take into consideration confidential information for the scoring. Anyone should be able to replicate the score for every company in the same way as we have been doing. And the maximum possible score for ChemScore is 48 points. Next slide, please. The first category is taking a closer look at the dark side of the companies, the production and use of highly hazardous substances. We have investigated from EU and US public registries which hazardous chemicals they produce. The ones we focus on in category 1 are the number of individual hazardous substances each company have registered in these regions. Substances of very high concern, substances being regulated by the POP or PIC conventions, as well as a highly hazardous pesticide assessed by PAN International. Now, it would be easy just to take the total number and base a score on it, but there is quite a difference in the financial risk depending on what chemical it is, the properties it has, and the level of regulation already in place or scheduled. Therefore, we have applied a system to place a higher weight on those substances that are listed as POPs or on the EU authorization list and the EU candidate list to account for the regulatory risk connected to such substances. However, also extremely persistent chemicals with infamous PFAS as the poster child are specifically pinpointed and penalized by the weighting system in order to account for the potential future liabilities waiting ahead of any company producing persistent chemicals. I'm sure you're all well aware of the tidal wave of litigations heading towards the PFAS producers in the US, and this is to factor in such future risks into the equation. Each hazardous substance is multiplied by the financial risk attributed to it, and is consequently summed up for each company to give a hazard mark. Further, we want to make sure that this category 1 benchmark is as region and company size neutral as possible to allow a fair comparison between the peers. Therefore, we divide the hazard mark with the revenue to account for company size, which differs by approximately a factor of 10 between the largest and smallest company in ChemScore. To also factor in that some of the companies have a very small market presence in the US and EU, and hence are also less likely to register any chemicals in these regions, we finally apply a percentage to the total part of sales in the EU-US. So if a company with a high presence in these 2 regions receive a higher score than one with little presence. Of course, you can find the precise calculations for how we do this in a methodology paper and on each company's detailed scorecard. As the production of hazardous chemicals is the most important part of any chemical company, the maximum score in this category is 18 points. Next slide, please. The second category is instead zooming in on the flip side of the companies, the development of safe alternatives. Does the company assess the sustainability of its products, and does it factor in intrinsic hazards in these assessments? And when they develop new products, do they apply strict cutoff criteria to make sure they step by step reduce the share of hazardous substances in their product portfolio? In category 2, we also look into the use of bio-based feedstock and mechanically recycled materials. All in all, in category 2, we look at if the company seems to be fit for the future demands with regard to products and processes. The maximum achievable score in this category is 12 points. Next slide, please. The third category investigates in more detail the company's policies and strategies regarding chemicals. to see if the management has taken the necessary step towards better chemicals management. We look at phase-out plans for existing hazardous products and if there are long-term commitments to become an entirely safe and sustainable by design company. Any policies driving towards a circular economy and relevant KPIs connected to circularity get rewarded in this category. Here, we also look at how transparent the company acts with regard to its hazardous product portfolio. Are they open about what they produce also in the parts of the world where there are no public registries? Are they willing to engage with civil society and communicate with us? The maximum score in category 3 is also 12 points. Next slide, please. And so, the final category, the controversies, it could be seen as a control station for each company if they are walking the talk. Companies could have the most ambitious policies and goals and appear as very good. However, this is not worth much if it's only worded in documents and not used hands-on in all the facilities. Failure to comply with internal rules and external laws will eventually result in accidents, spills, lawsuits and litigations, and this is what we strive to catch here. The maximum score in this last category is 6 points. So to sum up, with these 4 categories, 4 different ways of looking at the world's largest chemical producers, ChemScore tries to paint a broad and yet detailed picture of the covered companies with regard to the sustainability performance of chemicals. And with that, I will hand over to Sonja Heider, who will now share some key insights from this year's ranking. Thank you.
Thank you very much for handing over, Jirka, and walking us through the categories of ChemScore. And actually, I'm very proud and probably, yes, a bit pale to present you the key findings for ChemScore. Next slide, please. Here you immediately see the companies with the highest score in the top and the lowest score in the bottom. And as you know, we are ranking the largest global chemical companies worldwide, 54 of them. For the second year in a row, Indorama Ventures takes home the ChemScore title. Indorama produces plastics, PET, and textile yarns, and received 1 point more than last year. Nevertheless, the number of hazardous substances being produced has increased from 3 to 5, which is unfortunate. But however, Indorama is actively marketing safe alternatives and has various circular products and processes in place, as well as bio-based and hazard-free recycled raw materials. Air Products, the second in ChemScore, is an American gas company, also scoring 1 point more than in 2021. The company produces only one hazardous substance, carbon monoxide, and claims that this is an important building block for many industry and it's difficult to substitute. So therefore, the company can't gain a point on phase-out plans. Nevertheless, this low exposure to hazardous chemicals receives the high score Air Products gets here. And the third, Johnson Matthey, is based in UK, engaged in catalyst and hydrogen technology business. You already see that we have here 3 continents and very different chemical companies to compare. Nevertheless, they all made their way up to the top. And Johnson Matthey had additional 4 points, so jumped 2 places up to the 3rd position. And as a fun fact, the word sustainability has decreased from 200 times to 166 times in Johnson Matthey's report. Nevertheless, it's Johnson Matthey gets here cemented its position in the ChemScore ranking now due to its increased circularity efforts. A lot of points for circular topics, as it's now also the world's largest recycler of platinum group metals. At the bottom of our ranking, you see many Asian companies. Actually, the lower 10 are Asian companies plus DuPont. DuPont is a certain topic, a certain issue I will talk later about. For these lower ones, we have 2 to 8 points, and mainly because we really have a big gap of knowledge here about the production of the Asian companies. And also some of the essential ingredients of a chemical management are missing. For example, for Formosa Chemicals and Fibers, Nitodenko, Torre, and Tosso, we could not identify the product stewardship that evaluates the sustainability of their products. And 12 companies in the bottom range, we even miss an intrinsic hazard assessment. So please have a look at all these single scorecards to learn more about the companies. We have really detailed analysis for you and also included improvement points where you can see where, and probably also the progress in the coming years. So slides, please. So looking at the broader picture, you see now the scoring in these 3 different regions, and it's about 1/3 each, plus 1 Latin American, African company we don't have here. And actually, the scores are 48 points in total, but the top scorer Indorama scores 30, and on average we have 13.3 as a score, and this has not changed at all from the last year. So in total we don't see a change, but if we go then into the regions and into the companies, we see it. Europe is moving ahead, it's up 2 points, and North America almost the same, in Asia going down. And we do think that the legislation, the drive due to European Green Deal, but also the sustainable finance legislation is moving the companies. And so we see the change here. And if you now go into the content topics, next slide, please. I would like to highlight transparency. Transparency is key to understand. Only what we measure, we can manage. This is the phrase we hear so often in the ESG area, and this is true. But we have in the chemical sector, we really have quite a difficulty to see clearer, because there are no public data available for the regions outside of EU and US. And even for the knowledge we have, we still miss the information on volumes and on sales. Nevertheless, we have priced in this lack of information. So where we do not know a lot, as Jirka explained already, we score down. So, and this year, actually, we do have 2 major findings. First, the positive one: 2 companies, Eastman and Lanxess, were able to show that they do not produce any substances of very high concern, other than they do already in EU and US. So that means that we do know 100% of the hazardous portfolio, which is actually a milestone we celebrated here in ChemScore this year. But we also do have a negative surprise. And now coming to DuPont. The company has chosen to hide its whole production in the US by claiming it confidential. And actually, we asked the company if you missed something, if you missed a divestment or a corporate change of business. But no, that is not the case. But the company told us that claiming confidentiality is legal. And again, this is really against everything what ChemScore stands for. We really would like to create more transparency. And hiding the chemical portfolio, which no other company is doing like that, we felt it's impossible to reward DuPont with the points in other sections. And so we gave them 0 points in total and the grade F, which puts them in the bottom of our ranking. Next slide, please. This is another topic where we look at the certain substance groups. And actually, the persistent hazardous substances are the most important ones for us. And here you see in the circles We have 349 substances which single produced by all the ChemScore companies if you put them together. 38 of those are persistent ones, and a fraction of that, 6 of those substances are PFAS, so the perfluorinated substances, which are highly in the media at the moment. So again, persistent chemicals are those ones which do not break down and accumulate in nature in our bodies. So even when stopping production now, we will fight with the consequences, the global pollution for decades or even centuries to come. And as in ChemSec, we regard this chemical group as the one which should be phased out as soon as possible. And as you can see, the PFAS, which are the most well-known family of persistent chemicals, they only represent 15% of all the persistent ones. So the potential financial risk and liability connected to this group of chemicals are probably vastly underestimated. Next slide, please. And we looked at the persistent chemicals by each company. So, and you see this is a picture which is also valid almost for the whole hazardous portfolio. We still have companies going up with the number of substances. So these are only the persistent chemicals. So 39 we had. And you see the companies going up, the companies are going down, and those ones who still produce the same. And we really would like to see the arrows directing downwards in the coming years. Next slide, please. And actually, another milestone in ChemScore, and last but not least, this is designing out substances of very high concern. And 2 companies have publicly stated that they will not design in substances of very high concern into new products. And this is, in our eyes, a major achievement and will lead to a reduction of pollution in the future. And you can see also the difficulties we have sometimes if you read these 2 sentences. So Ecolab, one of these companies, they told us, and this is a statement from in the public domain, Ecolab's chemical ingredient policy also prohibits developing new products containing substances of very high concern. Whereby Lanxess is saying, we will not develop and market new end products containing substances greater than 0.1% that have the characteristics of the substance of very high concern. And actually, this, I would regard the lower statement as a more severe one, because it's not only the identified by the European Commission identified substance of very high concern, but all the chemicals which have the criteria of a substance of very high concern. So you see, this can be quite a difference, even if it sounds very similar. And that has meant a lot of digging deep into the details. And actually, I'm very happy today that we have Lanxess here that is stating one of the sentence, and you can hear more about their strategies. Thank you very much.
Yep. All right, so we have some time. Thank you, Sonja and Jerker. We have some time for Q&A here. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. So one to start with from Nirai Shandilia. How are the scores assigned when there is an absence of knowledge?
Of course, when we don't have any information, it's not possible to give a point. So no information means no points. It's very simple and straightforward.
Great. And then Zoe Freshin Pollard wonders, is there any worry that increased media focus on PFAS may miss the larger story on persistent chemicals as a whole, or create an opportunity for greenwashing by companies producing alternative hazardous chemicals? a very interesting question.
Well, I can start, but Jekka, please add. And actually, yes, I really do think that PFAS is just a small group of the persistent chemicals, and we really have to look at other persistent chemicals. And in our portfolio, in the ChemScore portfolio, we see that there are, for example, also UV filters in there, which you see in sunscreens, and also siloxanes. So there are more persistent chemicals which really should be in a high focus on for phasing them out by the chemical companies, but also a high focus by the investors, because it's the same story. The problems are not going away, and liabilities can come through.
Yeah, certainly. At present, other persistent chemicals are definitely in the media shadow of PFAS, but I think it's raising the awareness in society and among regulators that it's the persistent which is the critical point. So in the long run, I think it will have it's positive anyway. But right now, I agree, it's a media shadow for the other ones.
So Susan Deckers wonders, are the scores only based on the number of substances of very high concerns, or also on the quantities of substances of very high concern that are used or produced?
At present, we can only base it on the number of substances because there is no information available in these registers that we're using about. We can't really attach the amount produced for each chemical. Of course, that would be something, an ideal question for investors to ask. We can give them the names of the substances these companies are producing, and then the investors can ask the question. But it's no public register which shows that this company A is producing this substance at this amount. And without that information, we can't really factor it in. But ideally, that would be perfect.
And Lyudmila Strakodonskaya wonders, for those companies which are phasing out persistent chemicals on your previous slide, how do they do it? What are the solutions there? Replacements, alternatives, or product phase-outs?
I think there's something, a question we should ask those companies. I think they will be able to respond to you afterwards. But a good question.
And maybe also it will be a perfect bridge into our next session, actually, with one of these companies. So thank you, Jerker and Sonja.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I then would like to welcome Teresa Bernheim, who is Manager Chemicals Policy at Lanxess. The reason why we invited Teresa to this webinar is that Lanxess is the company that made the second largest score leap in this year's ChemScore and has made some truly noteworthy policy changes over the last year. So Teresa, welcome. Lanxess was very engaged in this year's ChemScore. You sent us the information we needed to make a proper assessment, and there were a lot of emails back and forth on the details and of the scoring and so on. Can you maybe just say something about why you spent time engaging with us?
Well, of course, first of all, thank you for having me today. It's really great to be part of this webinar. Well, to come to your question, actually, sustainability is one core element of our corporate strategy already since 2014. For example, we were in 2019 among the first chemical companies to set a target for becoming climate neutral by 2040. So, and we regularly report on our sustainability targets and achievements. And so in this regard, it is of course part of our company culture to engage with all stakeholders and to take their views and concerns seriously and to be transparent about what we do and why we do it. So it was natural for us to, of course, engage with ChemSec regarding our ChemScore report.
Right, and so you made two milestone changes, which were greatly rewarded in your ChemScore ranking this year. And one is that you are fully transparent about all the hazardous chemicals that you produce worldwide. Only one other company in ChemScore is. And the other is that you have, as Sonja mentioned in her presentation, announced that you will not develop any new end products containing hazardous chemicals above a very low threshold. So could you talk about these two policy changes, what they mean and how come you decided to implement them?
Well, probably I will start with the development of the new products. Well, in 2020, we adopted a new company policy concerning the elimination of critical substances from our portfolio. And by critical substances, we mean the substances that fulfill the criteria for substances of very high concern, as Sonja has already mentioned. So that means we develop so-called roadmaps for the phase out or the substitution of substances. But of course, it's not enough to get rid of the critical substances in the products that are already in our portfolio. It doesn't make sense then reintroduce critical substances in new products. So that's why we also made the decision to adjust our so-called innovation stage gate process. That means at the very beginning of research and development, if we discover that developing a new product would require using a substance of very high concern or a substance that fulfills those criteria, then the process is actually over, or we have to start new with another substance that has a different hazard profile. So therefore, we bring in our toxicological experts in a very early stage of our research to assess the substances we use and to make sure that those are not substances of very high concern. And when it comes to transparency, in my opinion, we have made a lot of progress in the past years. It wasn't really a policy change. It was more or less rather probably a cultural change. And we were already doing a lot in terms of sustainability, but it was quite obvious for everybody in the company. And we somehow realized we didn't communicate it sufficiently to the broader public. And this is actually what changed. So we started working on our communication in a way that we communicated more broadly what we are doing, and we're very happy that this is now being recognized.
Right. So were there any internal resistance towards the idea of, for example, not developing new end products with hazardous chemicals? How was the internal discussion around that?
Well, no, there was no resistance at all. It was more or less a no-brainer, of course, because we want to be ahead of the regulatory curve. We cannot produce a substance that is be regulated, prohibited, something like this that would also ruin our business in the long term. So it's actually also a business decision not to produce new products that contain substances of very high concern. The change was rather when it came to communication, because in the past it was simply not necessary to communicate on such topics as we do now. I think there was also a cultural change, probably also within the EU, that also investors were more and more interested in this topic, and also different sustainability ratings and rankings take this into account.
So can you elaborate the cultural change? What do you mean with that?
Well, it's about communicating on such topics, actually, so that you just, as we are now, that you become transparent as a company. That hasn't been required in the past. Nobody was really asking for it. So for us internally, as I said, it was obvious to work on sustainability, but it was not obvious to communicate on this that broadly. We communicated with our investors, but we did not necessarily put something on our homepage in a language that also non-experts could understand. And that is what we have changed when we saw that now more and more stakeholders are asking for this information. And actually, it was quite easy to implement this in the end.
And so if someone's listening to this, someone who's working maybe at another chemical company and they think sounds like policies that we should implement. Do you have any recommendations for how they should promote it internally in their companies and what they should think about?
Well, what we did at Lanxess, we brought everyone from different departments at the virtual table during COVID, of course, like legal department, investor relations, regulatory affairs people, communication experts. So you need to, of course, involve like all different kind of professions to take everybody with you, to bring everybody on board. And then actually, once we did that, it was quite easy.
Great. And today Lanxess has a C grade on ChemScore, which is a great improvement from last year's D+, but there's still a lot to do. What do you see as the biggest possibilities and obstacles to improving your grade further?
Well, of course, we do not relax now that we got a better score. We need to keep work on it, of course. And the biggest room for improvement, from my point of view, is the reduction of hazardous substances in our product portfolio. Actually, those substances only accounted for 3% of our total sales in the last year, but still it takes time to develop suitable alternatives, and it takes even more time to bring them on the market, to get them tested and approved by and accepted, especially by our customers. We are at the very beginning of the supply chain, and often if we want to introduce a new product to the market, that also requires changing the way of processing at our customers. And so we have to convince them to change a running system, introduce something new, and probably also have to deal with setbacks. And that just doesn't happen overnight. So that takes time, but we are working on it. And I'm pretty confident that Lanxess actually is on a good path, and that this will also be reflected even more by our ChemScore grades in the years to come.
So you would say that time is your biggest obstacle that you're facing?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, a quite existential take on your future, but very interesting. And yes, thank you for sharing these interesting insights and hearing about how you implemented these milestone policy changes. And I look very much forward to following your efforts to reach an even higher grade in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you. We're working on it.
Great, thank you. So now I want to welcome Victoria Lidén, sustainability analyst at Storebrand Asset Management, who has been a real front runner in the investor community when it comes to addressing the chemical issue. And I would like to start off with a quite straightforward question to Victoria. Why should investors care about hazardous chemicals?
Yes, and thank you, Patrick. Firstly, I would say that ChemSec is the front runner. Very happy to be here today, and congratulations to the successful launch of this ranking, and also very interesting to hear some good examples here from Teresa and Lanxess. But coming back to your question, so within the field of ESG and sustainable investing, we have seen for the past years a great focus on the green transition. But what is also sometimes forgotten are all those chemicals that must go into the manufacturing of batteries for electric cars, manufacturing of solar panels, or into the recycling processes. And, you know, Patrick, this was really, for me personally, as an investor coming not from a chemical expert side to this was an eye-opener how a company operating with recycling of electronics, they also use hazardous chemicals in the recycling process to separate and recycle precious metals. So this was an eye-opener, and ESG is not black and white, and therefore we saw the need to address this issue of hazardous chemicals. And from an investor perspective, we of course see both risks and opportunities here. We believe that the issue of hazardous chemicals could influence the company's financial performance, mainly through risks related to coming regulation and the legal responsibilities tied to this. The American Environmental Protection Agency earlier this year laid out a plan to toughen the rules for persistent chemicals. The EU is also now looking to tighten legislation. And of course, in recent years, we have also seen many lawsuits filed against PFAS manufacturers, and the companies are actually forced to make provisions in their balance sheets to cover for compensation linked to these lawsuits. One example being, for example, DuPont. So to answer your question, we have seen how chemicals not considered a problem today might become significant liabilities in the future and actually impact the company's share price. So that's something we as investors, of course, are concerned about. But using ChemScore, we as investors can try to foresee and manage these risks in a better way.
And how do you think the awareness is in the more generally in the investor community about the risks and opportunities connected to hazardous chemicals?
Well, I think the awareness is growing, and I think we can also see this now with the participants in this webinar and with the initiative we launched, which Jeannie will talk a bit more about later on. And I think that apart from just focusing on the risks I described now, we're also seeing a great focus on the opportunities in terms of innovation and investing in that innovation. When some chemical substances are restricted, there will be a need for alternative chemicals and green substitutes. And we see that the producers of these alternatives, they can really gain a competitive advantage and market share. So that is, of course, also very interesting. And I think that's something that more and more investors are waking up to and realizing.
Right. Yeah. And can you maybe explain a little bit how you use ChemScore in your daily work? Maybe for someone who's not an investor who, is curious about that.
Yeah, of course. So at the Storebrand and in my team, we monitor thousands of companies' ESG profile in order to identify ESG risks in our portfolio. And for that, we mainly use third-party ESG data providers for that screening we're doing. But these data providers usually don't go very much in depth on specific sector-specific issues. So therefore, we saw the need to complement the screening with NGO reports and external rankings, such as ChemScore, which gives us more technical understanding of this topic. So what we do in our daily work, and especially now when we have received this new ranking, is that we screen our portfolio. So we use both the ChemScore and the SIN list in order to identify our risk exposure to companies producing these hazardous chemicals. So we are then mapping our exposure and identifying high-risk companies, which we have to evaluate further. So this way we use the ChemScore ranking both to identify the leaders and the laggards, and then we can incorporate that understanding into our investment decisions. So should we invest or not in this company? Should we sell down or hold the company? Or should we exclude or try to engage and so on? And one, I would say, very practical example of this is last year when we got the ChemScore ranking. We decided to engage with 3 of the companies using ChemScore data. And we also got the support from the ChemSec team, providing us with expertise on this very technical issue. And so I was very happy to see that all those 3 companies showcased an improvement in this year's ranking. So I think that shareholder engagement and working and addressing this issue is really works.
Great. And on to continue on that, you were quoted in the Financial Times the other day, and you said that Storebrand would raise concerns about PFAS at board level and support shareholder resolutions and vote against the election of directors if engagement efforts proved unproductive. I don't know if you can just elaborate a little bit on this and how you decide to you know, what tools to use to put pressure on the companies that you own?
Yeah, of course. And I think that it's really important for investors to have this kind of escalation procedure. So at Storebrand, if the outcome of an engagement doesn't meet our expectation, we can consider other actions. So we have an escalation process. We can express our views publicly by issuing a public statement or collaborating with other investors, if not the case already, which we are doing now with this letter and this investor initiative. We can also raise the issue to the board level if the senior management is not responsive to our concerns. We can propose and file or co-file resolutions at the AGM. And we can also vote against certain directors. So as a last resort, when we have tried all these different routes and venues, if this has been unsuccessful and we see that the company is not meeting our standards, then of course we might have to take it to an exclusion. But I think there are many ways we can use these different tools as investors to escalate on engagements.
Right, great. Yeah, you talked a little bit about this, but finally, just briefly, what do you see as the biggest challenges and what do you see as the biggest opportunities for the chemical sector in the coming years?
So I think that the main problem with how the chemical companies are managing this issue of hazardous chemicals today is the lack of transparency, which we also mentioned in this webinar. Many chemical companies communicate their green products, but they are not communicating which harmful chemicals they're producing. And in particular, as Jerker highlighted before, the volumes of these hazardous chemicals they produce. So when looking at these companies, they're producing thousands of different chemicals, but as investors, we have very limited insight and information about the credentials and volumes of these chemicals, especially outside the EU and the US. And the data they are required by law to submit to different registers is also confidential. So it sometimes leaves us as investors in the dark when it comes to their production of hazardous chemicals. So I think that is the main challenge going forward.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Victoria, for shedding some very interesting investor light on this topic. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. And yes, and if you have any questions for Victoria or any of the other guests, please put them in the Q&A chat and they'll get back to you via email. So finally, I would like to welcome Eugenie Matthew, who is Earth Lead at Aviva Investors. Aviva has been one of our key partners since the start of ChemScore, and Eugenie have played a pivotal role in spreading awareness of this topic to a broader investor audience. And recently, Aviva and Storebrand and 45 other investors representing $8 trillion sent a letter to the largest chemical companies in the world. And Eugenie, maybe can you talk about that letter? Why did you write it? What was it?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. So in September, we had gathered a big group of investors, as Patrick mentioned, Storebrand, Aviva, and 45 other large investors to write to the companies in the ChemScore analysis to say that we really wanted to see more transparency to persuade companies to disclose that the names of the hazardous chemicals they are producing around the world and the volumes, because this is something that we still don't know. And whilst there are decent records in the EU and records in the US that are published every 4 years, it means still that the outside world doesn't have a full picture of which chemicals are being produced where and by who. So we asked for 3 things. The first was increased transparency, as I just mentioned. The second was for to set a target date for a phase out of persistent chemicals, because we think that these are at the moment the chemicals that are most companies most at risk of litigation, and we're seeing increasing legislation here, and the environmental damage and threat to human health is quite significant. And then finally, we ask companies to work to improve their score in the ChemScore analysis, because we think this is a great ranking to be able to compare companies on the same set of indicators and get really in-depth analysis of how companies are doing on this issue. We're really pleased that we had saw this year the doubling of the number of investors interested in this. We were up from 23 investors last year. We wrote a similar letter a year ago. So a real doubling in the number of investors and the assets that they represent from 2021 to 2022. So we are now formalizing this investor letter into what we're calling the Investor Initiative on Hazardous Chemicals. And we are planning to coordinate engagement with the companies. I think Patrick will be sending a survey around to investors who signed the first letter. Signed this most recent letter, and to ask which companies they want to join calls with. And we're always ChemSec will be organising more webinars, educational webinars, and investor coordination webinars to coordinate investors' work in this area and give feedback on the methodology and the approach of ChemSec. And if anybody on this call is interested in joining, I'd be really grateful if you could please get in touch with me, because we are still very keen to have more investors on board.
And what are your ambitions and hopes for the future of this initiative?
Well, I'm really pleased to have seen the first signs of progress this year. We found in the last 2 years not a huge amount of change year on year, but we've seen the first 4 companies are giving information on the chemicals they're producing, and the 2 companies that are committing to phasing out the hazardous chemicals and new products. So I'm really excited that we're beginning to see some signs of change, and want to build on that momentum and get more investors to push for more change next year.
Great. Yeah, I think on that positive note, I think we should start to wrap up. And yeah, thank you very much, Janie, for coming on to talk about this. Yeah, very exciting initiative. So yeah, I would like to say again, thank you to Teresa, Victoria, and Janie for participating in this webinar. I think it's been very inspiring to hear about all the developments that are taking place, because what you have all explained today in different ways is that it's not utopian, but both possible and quite sensible to take concrete steps towards a safer and more sustainable chemical sector. And finally, I would like to also say thanks to Jerker and Sonja for having done such an astonishing job with this year's ChemScore. They spent half a year really working tirelessly in a cave of annual and sustainability reports and other highly technical documents. And I honestly think that the number of rows and columns and tabs in their Excel sheets must be closing in on some kind of historical record. So it's really impressive that you've been able to condense this massive amounts of data into such a user-friendly and easily understandable tool that ChemScore is. So thank you, and please get some rest now. And finally, thanks to all of you who listened in. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and that we'll be in touch again soon. So bye.